Hello, and welcome to the Dissonance Podcast, where we talk about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. This week, Elizabeth is joined by friend of the podcast, Mark Horowitz, to discuss two very different articles about viewpoint diversity. In one paper, the authors examined thousands of college course syllabi. In their three areas of focus, racism, the Israel-Palestine conflict, and abortion, faculty overwhelmingly listed assignments that represented only one perspective. The vast majority did not include books or articles identified as well-known and respected alternative views. The second article is an argument against viewpoint diversity and a criticism of Heterodox Academy. The author is probably correct that hiring individuals solely because they have unusual views would do little to advance science, but the narrow and extreme examples she offers are too superficial to be convincing. Mark shares his own research findings regarding groupthink in academia and the benefits of viewpoint diversity, and reminds us of our previous dissonance conversations, which you can find linked in the show notes. Hello, and welcome back to the Dissonance Podcast, and welcome back to Mark Horowitz, who is an occasional contributor to the Dissonance Podcast. And we are here today to talk about, not surprisingly, I guess, diversity, but also just what does viewpoint diversity mean? And I had sent Mark an article that's not, as far as we know, is not yet published, about that where some authors analyzed syllabi. I did not know about the open syllabi project or whatever it's called. Open syllabus project. And they analyzed syllabi for viewpoint diversity. And then he sent me an article about viewpoint diversity from an entirely different perspective. So we're going to try to talk about both of those. And I think just for no other reason except that I sent you one first, let's just start with one that's called Closed Classrooms, ? An analysis of college syllabi on contentious issues. And Shields, Avner, and I don't know, Muravich, I don't know how to pronounce. Sorry, Stephanie, that's your first name. Sorry for at Claremont, mispronouncing your name. So this article got a little bit of a, I think they were interviewed for the Chronicle of Higher Ed. I saw a couple of other things. It got a little bit of a splash because they did do this analysis of syllabi that are posted on the internet. So that is by no means a complete list of everything that people teach. And they chose 3 topics to look to see what was assigned for classes. They chose racial issues, they chose Israel-Palestine, and they chose abortion, and analyzed the kinds of materials that were assigned in these courses. So now I've talked too much, so now it's your turn to say anything that you might want to say to sort of get us oriented, get the listeners.
Well, I was certainly delighted that you reached out to me because I hadn't seen that article, the Shields, which actually we can say Shields et al. To avoid mispronouncing. But I was intrigued by the piece because over the last maybe 10 years, I've gotten deeply involved in kind of advocating for viewpoint diversity in the classroom. My own teaching style, I teach a senior seminar course for a social behavioral science program that I used to direct at Seton Hall University, and I structure it in complete alignment with what Shields is advocating. Shields and Associates are advocating. And one of the controversies I have in the course is on racial inequality. So it was quite interesting that he was talking about the Michelle Alexander book. And just for the listener, I mean, Shields' basic argument, as I understand it, Elizabeth, you can chime in if you see it somewhat differently. He's basically they use the Open Syllabus Project, which apparently has tens of millions of syllabi already.
I know,
right?
I'm going to be checking this out.
Oh yeah, very useful. I played around a little bit, but I guess you can pay for more analytics and that sort of thing. And they were able to show that in classes dealing with racial disparity in crime and incarceration, what you'll find again and again, overwhelmingly so, is an asymmetry. So you'll have Michelle Alexander's book, but it won't be coupled with prominent critics, as the authors themselves claim. These people are prominent critics that have been cited in the literature, that challenge the core thesis of the new Jim Crow. And they obviously are critical of that. And I was interested just because I'll be quiet. I was interested because I used to assign as an option to students the new Jim Crow, but it's just simply too long for students to realistically read in a semester. It's almost 400 pages. So I've opted for books on racial inequality that are much more readable. Go ahead.
Well, that's what I was just going to ask you. So you're in sociology, I'm in psychology. I don't know if there's a couple of these readings, because you teach a course that includes this, a couple of these readings for the listener, like what is the sort of organizing theme of, say, the new Jim Crow and or one of the others?
Yeah, so the way I can get the new Jim Crow in a minute. The way I approach my course is that I used to offer over a dozen sensitive social science controversies for students to choose from. I'm not able to do that anymore, in part because of AI and the rampant amount of cheating. So what I've done is I've narrowed the course down to 3 choices, and I've read the book options I give to the students in advance, so then I can test them on actually reading the book, so they're not just using ChatGPT for their papers. But the way I structure it is around racial inequality broadly. Alexander's book deals more specifically with racial incarceration disparities, making the claim that white supremacy is alive and well, that it didn't so much disappear after Jim Crow, but changed form, and that the war on drugs and the disparities in incarceration by race illustrate that we still live in a white supremacist society. And then you have critics of that thesis. And the author Shields and others get into the critics and what they substantively claim. I deal in my course with racial inequality, not just in terms of incarceration, but more broadly. Why do we have such entrenched disparities in outcomes by racial group? Black-white is specifically what I focus on. And again, used to assign new Jim Crow as an option. But now I use much more readable, something students can realistically read. I use Ijeoma Oluo's book, So You Want to Talk About Race. It's one of the anti-racist books. Mm-hmm. Other major figures like Ibram Kendi, he's obviously well known, and Shields and colleagues talk about Coates' book, Between the World and Me, as another book that's signed across thousands and thousands of syllabi. So I assign that as an option if they choose the controversy on racial inequality. I have 2 options. If they choose that controversy, but then they have to read a book called Taboo, which is written by this controversial scholar. Oh, I'm forgetting his name. Wilfred Riley. So he's controversial. He might have been on this podcast.
He has been on the podcast a few times. Yeah.
So I assign that book, which clearly takes a completely countervailing view to racial inequality than the anti-racist literature does. And I've been a long advocate. Again, it's why I was delighted that you sent me this article to talk with you about, because it's in alignment with what I believe is important in higher ed, and not just internal to higher ed, but in terms of addressing sort of wider societal and social polarization that we're experiencing. We're not in good times. I think we can both agree with that.
I'm wondering, because I don't teach a class specifically on this, but the new Jim Crow is very familiar, and I'm pretty sure I remember. I don't see it now where I might have I did highlight it, but like, am I remembering this right? Like 60,000 citations that it's been cited 60,000 times or something.
I wrote it down. Yeah, it might be 90 even.
Might be 90. Okay.
90. I mean, some absolutely incredible. I think the author pointed out more than Shakespeare, more than
right
major works, right?
But then, one of my complaints about this article was that they're quite sure about the counter narrative things that should be assigned. And I'm assuming that this database is so huge that they could not possibly have, I don't know if they searched for something like taboo. Like, I don't know. We don't know that, right? They listed the things and they say, which kind of irked me, just a small thing, but they were like, it was easy. Generally speaking, it was an easy exercise. That's like, generally speaking, this was an easy exercise. And I put a big question mark. So they were guided primarily by citation counts and their own familiarity with academic literature. So they identified some of the most canonical texts on each issue. And I was like, okay, because what I wondered is exactly what you already mentioned, which is that you are assigning either parts of books sometimes, a chapter that you might post, because we're allowed to do that, by the way. That's not copyright infringement. We are allowed to post, just for educational purposes, just some parts of things, an article, not just a book, but an article or something like that. Maybe assign it in a classroom for, like an activity in the classroom, or like an impromptu kind of presentation, or more planned presentation. So I just wondered, because you do teach this particular topic or give it as an option, did you recognize all of the texts that they indicated were, the counter to the new Jim Crow?
Yeah, and I didn't, for
Okay.
one. And I do remember when I was using New Jim Crow as an option for students weren't really reading it. It was too long.
Mm-hmm.
And then I wasn't able to find, a good counterpoint specific to her book. I organized the class around books that are popular, written for a popular audience. So those law articles that she cites are very good. They're very dense. But yeah, they're certainly not as well known. A case could be made that even professors aren't aware of it per se when they're teaching the new Jim Crow. So I agree with you that the idea that it's easy to know what the intellectual counterpoint to a particular argument would be is problematic, to say the least. But I still, in spirit, believe that we ought to be striving. So when I moved away from the new Jim Crow book, I just again decided to use a more readable one. I suggested Kendi at one point. I don't think the Coates book, Between the World and Me, I may have one semester offered that as an option too for students, as long as they have two countervailing texts that take opposing positions in the controversy. And what's important to me isn't so much in making sure we identify the precise book. And I'm not talking about the Shields argument, which we can get back to in a second. What's important to me is that students are encountering arguments they're hearing over the kitchen table. If they have moderate or conservative parents, or they're just observing political life, these arguments they're going to be hearing all the time, and yet they're going to come to class and they're going to get consistently this one side, and they're not hearing the other side. And it's probably the spirit that Shields and his co-authors brought into it, even if they exaggerate how easy it is to find a countervailing source.
Yeah, I was just thinking, as you sort of alluded to, which is there's a difference between a popular press book, a book that appears at Barnes and Noble, and that therefore, even if it's a difficult topic, it's written for a more general audience. And there's a difference between that and some of these more academic, maybe an economics kind of version. Even Taboo is written, it's very approachable, but he is using, that would maybe be the most approachable, I think, of some of these ones that were listed. I mean, I just looked them up just to see what a couple of them were, and they seemed a lot higher level to me. So if you're in a graduate program, or if this is the only thing you're going to do in your class, so many times in classes, it's not the only thing that we do, right? We have, like you said, you used to do many more topics, but now you do at least 3, right? I'm doing a class right now in social psych. I'm going to try to maybe get in 8 topics, and teach teach some of the theories of social psych under topics like you are that are considered sort of important to the world. So yeah, and it's not easy. It is not easy to find, because I'm doing this for the first time in many years. Same like you. I'm like, oh, they used to read, they don't read anymore. They used to write, they don't write anymore. So I'm completely rejiggering my class, and completely, it's like a whole new thing. And it's not easy to find things that not only match, or sort of match up in approachability, but then also have this diversity. It really isn't as easy, but they do say that in their discussion. They do say, oh, well, you might say that we haven't included enough. And they are right that these percentages are so convincing that even our little picayunes, right, our little complaints about the article or whatever. I mean, it's hard to argue with the statistics. Like I'm just looking how near here now. Frequency with which, this is table 1, so very first table. Frequency with which prominent critics are assigned with Alexander's The New Jim Crow. They range from 3.46%, so 3.5%, to under 8%. So I'm sorry, not under 8%, under 0.8%.
Oh, okay.
0.8%, not 8%. So the highest percentage was like 3.5%. And so, yeah, I mean,
I think another thing they point out is when they find courses that do teach the sort of non-heterodox perspective, it's almost always accompanied by still with something like New Jim Crow or Between the World and Me. So it's really an asymmetry. And this, I guess this would be the wider point. I don't know if you'd fully agree with this, Elizabeth, but my wider point would be that I agree there's some grounds for methodological criticism in their to perhaps blithe confidence that they're finding the countervailing sources. I still think their deeper point is accurate, which is we do have a problem with kind of ideological monoculture in how the social sciences address this question. I mean, students are not. I asked them in class because when I'm presenting the topic of racial inequality as one of the options for a controversy, I'll just say casually to students, why is it? First of all, we talk about what racial inequality is. We talk about different indicators of racial inequality, high school attainment, wealth, income, disparate rates of incarceration, for example, right? And then I'll say, well, why is this? And I have never encountered ever, and I've been doing this for 10 years at Seton Hall, a single student ever say anything but, well, the history of slavery and Jim Crow is alive and well today. Some variant of that.
mm-hmm.
Still racism, and now there's microaggressions. And my point in the class isn't to say that perspective is wrong. My position in the class is to say, okay, that's an interesting perspective if you considered any other ones. And if you choose this controversy and you do read the Riley book, you're going to encounter an argument that's likely to surprise you and maybe even unsettle you.
Yeah.
So the fact that it's such a clarion call of only one side. And some of the kind of conservative critics of higher ed suggest that there's been a fire survey of this, suggesting that more conservative students feel like they self-censor. So that might be part of it. I don't know. I don't know how many conservative students arrive at my senior seminar course, though, in social behavioral sciences, but they might be self-censoring. You never know.
Yeah. I think you're right, but yeah, it's hard to know, but because they're not going to reveal there. And I hope that most of the time they don't know my political orientation. I hope, or my belief, So as you said, so in table 2, so they have a counter table in each of these categories, right? So in table 2, they do list the sort of the possible diverse reading. Yeah. So instead of be less than 1% up to 3.5%, now we have that maybe controversial text being assigned anywhere from, well, one is only 25%, but most of them are 80% assigned with. So if this more sort of challenging the social norm, I guess, text or is assigned, then it's almost always paired with the Alexander text. So yeah, they are. It is pretty convincing. They do. They also do say that for this topic, it is mostly your field, sociology, history, that's assigning these books the most. I don't think psychology is not even on the list. So
okay, maybe you're liberated from the problem. You're above that.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what. No, I did things like I did like you. I listed the things that I would be prepared to talk about, a social psychological perspective of certain things. And they're not interested, for example, in the environment. Not interested in social psychology. Because they ranked things. And so, interestingly, they were interested in healthcare, which I was happy about. I mean, that's a relevant, current topic. So, I did not offer racism.
Mm-hmm.
I did not offer that because we have so many courses on campus that deal with that. I know. Okay,
It was
so
interesting if I can jump in for a second, because you
yeah,
said, well, books that run against the social norm,
uh-huh.
they're almost always accompanied by the more mainstream book. But the point I was making earlier is higher education is so adrift from mainstream opinion that just because
Hmm.
it's the dominant book in higher ed doesn't mean it's the
You're
dominant
right.
social view. I
Yeah,
mean, we
yeah,
have,
absolutely, 100%, right? Like you said, what they're hearing, what they're experiencing elsewhere, and yeah, the social norm within higher ed, I
yeah,
think, is
which if critics are right, and in full disclosure, I think they are. And I come, just for the listener who hasn't heard us talk before, Elizabeth, I have a lifetime of progressive activism, so it's not like I'm coming from some right wing view here. But I think the conservative critics are correct that we do have a monoculture. We do have a perspective that is very shielded, and I think the shield, no pun intended, piece shows that they're not getting, even if their methodology is somewhat flawed, they're not getting very often countervailing ideas. And I think we're in a moment historically and culturally in our society where we have to actively advocate this. We have to actively advocate ideas that unsettle us. I think we've talked about this before, Elizabeth, I've heard on other podcasts too, the kind of therapeutic culture that we're
yeah, I mean,
encountering.
that's what your research has shown, right? And that is, that is, again, that's sort of the norm within higher ed, is that we must, that um, yeah, and I think, and you and I agreed that to a large extent, we're not helping them by doing, but we're not helping students
Yeah,
by
and
doing.
if part of the therapeutic culture is like, don't even encourage ideas that unsettle you, I mean, that then we're really, really abdicating our core responsibility in higher education if we're not encouraging students to take on ideas that can sometimes be uncomfortable. And again, when we're in a wider society right now of such eroding trust, I think part of it is this fearfulness. Yeah, so I do my best in classrooms to navigate sensitive topics, I think, effectively, and I
And
would.
do they do they talk do they openly comfortable? I mean, do you think they're sharing honestly?
I think to some extent. I mean, it's a weird thing. There's other issues that are at play that you and I've talked about before that muddy the waters of assessing what's going on. So I'm a professor who I've tried not to change my grading policies over the years. So for the first time in 25 years of teaching, I'm getting bad evaluations, which never occurred before, which links to the whole but many things we've talked about before. Students coming in, there's no standardized tests anymore. They're getting pushed through high school, grades are going up, skill sets are apparently going down, so they're less prepared than ever. And then when you have a professor like me who's just maintaining the grades I always have maintained, that can be a reason for them to vent frustration. So that muddies the water. So I don't know if their disengagement is because of the political sensitivity or because of their irritation about the rigor that I try to continue maintaining. It's not easy in higher ed today.
No, it is not. No, it is not. So their next topic was Israel and Palestine. Again, I can't speak to, the, texts that they picked. But this is the one. Orientalism is the one that was cited nearly 90,000 times.
Okay, that's the
So,
one.
but they're all up. They're in the tens of thousands. All of those, all like the Alexander text too. They found this book assigned in nearly 16,000 courses. More often than the Elements of Style by by Strunk and White and blah blah blah. Um, they do offer, they say that, there's some obvious texts, again, that would be assigned if you were trying to, if you were making an attempt at viewpoint diversity. And they found basically very similar, although I will say that the numbers are a little bit higher here. They're in the tenths, so it's like 12%, 10%. There's some here at 5%. So it's a smidgen better, but not much. And same pattern when you go the opposite way. And the texts that they argue would be, counter narratives to the Orientalism. We get, very different, very different results. The opposite pattern, 75%, 50%, again, this patterns. Again, we have courses here. I think they list, so history, English literature, political science, sociology. Again, psychology is not on the list, but be history and literature. Again, that's assigning most of these books. Although I was a little surprised because I think that it seems like there's some economics kind of stuff in there, but they weren't on the list. Same pattern again for abortion, although very different courses. And so the pattern is the same, but there is more diversity, more viewpoint diversity. And they suggest that perhaps because most of it is this is taught more in philosophy, and philosophy, even not just the courses, but the way that philosophy teaches, those of us who struggled through that logic course that we all had to take in philosophy in order to get our degrees. It was painful, but we did it. We know that, if, then this, and so on and so forth. And they're trying to teach you that, specifically. So they make more efforts in that field to find, diverse texts is what the suggestion. So, although the pattern is the same, the statistics are a little bit better. I don't know how many courses there are that use abortion. They did mention that that many more of them are in religiously affiliated schools.
And then you would expect the counterpoint to that major book being brought up a lot, then the case against it, right, rather than in favor of it. My take on the philosophy, I would add to the idea that it's part of their disciplinary tradition to encourage that. But I also think, I haven't done a study of it, I would be very surprised. This might be one field where you're not going to have as high degree of progressive predominance. Like you're probably going to get more moderate, similar to economics. You'll get more moderates than liberals. I would expect that. I don't know if it's the case. Yeah. And in regard to the Israel thing, I'm also not an expert by any stretch on it. Over the years, I've read independently on obviously the Israeli-Palestine conflict. Said's book is clearly most dominant in the world. I know, like they juxtapose it to like Huntington's Class of Civilization, and that's another major work. And they just show, like, when Huntington's book is assigned, it's almost always you're going to get the Said, but when Said is assigned, you're very often not going to get points of view that are kind of pro-Israel, if you want to put it in simplistic terms. Right? This is obviously the most sensitive of the three, I think, to even discuss, especially in today's climate. But I would still encourage. I considered it when I got to Seton Hall. I considered doing like an Israel point counterpoint, and I hate to concede this, but I just felt it was too hot, and I didn't want to get into that quagmire. So I avoided it. But the authors are showing again that same asymmetry, that you have an overwhelmingly a kind of anti-Israel, if you want to frame it that way, or pro-white supremacy or white culture over the East that gets promulgated, and then it's absent voices of the counter narrative of Israel as a force for good in the world, force for democracy in the world. And I'd go back to my initial point. I think, and this is the reason why I encouraged us to do that other piece in the AAUP, against viewpoint diversity, because I feel so strongly that the way to deal with these issues is to have open discussions about positions that take contrasting views, and to actually actively cultivate that as part of what higher education is engaged in.
And they are not, just to be clear, like this, they really, and they put it in, they do address this, but they're really not arguing for a like left-wing approach and a right-wing approach. Right. They really are staying away from that. They're not picking texts that are clearly clearly they're not politically, choosing texts that are political so much as they are a content, sort of social, ideological in their social views, but not necessarily Democrat, Republican, progressive, whatever. So, their conclusion, they didn't. I mean, it's a long article in some ways, because they really are. They build their case throughout. So they're showing the pattern on these three topics. And I assume that they chose those three topics because each author probably is from the, a sort of knows that area.
Yeah,
And so that's
that
why
makes the most. I
yeah,
suspected the same thing. Yeah.
yeah. But they, they really make the case that, as we get down to the end, we're educating tomorrow's leaders. They're probably not going to lead us anywhere that we want to go if they have a distorted sense of social reality. Justice seeking requires good truth seekers, and that in turn necessitates a broad exposure to the most informed minds. And then, of course, at the very end, they leave us in this not very hopeful kind of place. So our findings might be interpreted as evidence for the excessive politicization of higher ed. We're often told, after all, that universities have become too political. But in another sense, our evidence shows the opposite. Universities aren't politicized enough. Courses that evade or deny scholarly controversy sideline political contention. And that marginalization of politics that has undermined it is that marginalization of politics that has undermined public confidence in the university.
That's exactly what I would say. It's like their university is getting increasingly out of balance with where public opinion is on a variety of different issues. And I would quibble a little with their formulation there. It's not so much we want to bring politics in.
Right.
We want to bring in the unfortunate reality that as human beings, our moral and emotive values influence our political tribes. These things just influence how we end up constructing knowledge and pursuing the truth. And because of that tendency, which is something that advocates of Heterodox Academy advocate, because of this tendency, we should cultivate and go out of our way to ensure that we have diverse viewpoints. And the way I've translated that into my classroom practice is to make sure students they're required to read 2 books that take contrasting positions. It doesn't always fall on left-right lines, but generally speaking,
yes.
there's a tribal difference between those who believe one side of the equation. I mean, a little later, I can actually read some of the topics if you were curious about, like, over the years, what topics and books I've given them as options to read.
Mm-hmm.
But again, now I've narrowed it down to just 3 controversies.
So that I do think that that's a good lead in to the other to the article that you sent me, which is if it's not out, it says the full issue is going to be published in October. It's Academy Magazine. I mean, I don't follow this, so I didn't. This was new to me. But this is now. How do you pronounce this author's name?
That's a great question. Saraganian?
Yeah,
maybe?
I think so. And the title is 7 Theses Against Viewpoint Diversity. And I would argue that so in the other article, they really, although they address political orientation at the end of their article, they try to stay away from politics in the rest of it. They put it in the discussion. They did not put it in the body of their paper. I would argue that this person is so narrowly focused on politics that her argument, she's making a good argument, but the argument that she's making is so narrow. This is her definition through this, is that diversity means political diversity. And so she's arguing against, or says that there are 7 arguments against diversity, but she is not focused at all on the same thing that the other authors are, which is, academic texts that interpret social phenomenon, social statistics, economic statistics in a different way. So, when we talk about race, it's like, okay, like, as you said, like, here's why we have too many racial minorities incarcerated. No, here's why we have too many right? This article, I would argue that the main problem with this article, to me, was that she takes this idea, and she's right, that diversity of any shape, size, or variety does not automatically lead us to truth. So inserting, more conservatives, putting more conservatives on a faculty does not, a faculty group, inserting more, any kind of diversity does not necessarily lead us to a better, a more truthy truth, or a better solution. So So that was my feeling as we go. I felt that there was this sort of fatal flaw, although her arguments are good. I think she's a lawyer. Her arguments are good. But I wasn't that, you know, the fact that she focused so much on politics as being the only kind of diversity that we might be interested in, I found a flaw.
Well, my take might be even less accommodating to hers than yours. You're ceding ground in terms of the validity of her argument. I'm going to push back a little. My take on her view, she's arguing against viewpoint diversity itself, which is it's really one of the three central principles of Heterodox Academy. Heterodox Academy also encourages constructive disagreement and open inquiry. So you have these basic ideas that we ought to be encouraging the viewpoint diversity side, not just one perspective. I think what she's saying is that she's saying that once you open the door to viewpoint diversity, you basically have to open yourself up to all manners of past ideas that have been long demonstrated to be untrue, crackpot ideas. She makes the point that viewpoint diversity means that we have to go back to like the phlogiston theory, prior to oxygen, in chemistry, or she even mentions Holocaust denial in our World War II classes. And my take on that is that maybe you didn't mean that was the good part of her argument in the first place.
No, I did not. No.
Yeah. But my point with that would simply be that to advocate more voices is not the same thing as a relativist position. So I think she's kind of classic straw.
Conflating, in my opinion, I guess that's my point, is she's conflating those two to me. And so she's, but it is true. She says, however it is qualified or danced around, the pursuit of truth remains as foundational to a higher education faculty as it ever was. And viewpoint diversity, does not, opposes that pursuit. I don't agree with that. I'm not saying that I agree with that. But
if viewpoint diversity means we have the Holocaust deniers and the phlogiston believers, then she'd be right.
Exactly.
That's not what it means. No one advocates that. I mean, I suppose she could make the claim, once you rhetorically commit, somehow it automatically necessitates, and I would call that kind of a slippery slope or some kind of ad absurdum kind of argument. But the politics thing is a little trickier. She makes the claim that this is really a kind of Trojan horse. She actually cites an old piece by Stanley Fish against the firebrand kind of right-wing academic David Horowitz. No relation.
Yes.
So he advocated this Bill of Rights back in 2004, using some of the language that Heterodox uses, and kind of implies that that's kind of what this really is, a kind of conservative Trojan horse organization. And I remember looking at some of this data earlier, so I reacted kind of like, what is she talking about? Internally to Heterodox, they've polled themselves, and about 45% identify as liberal within the organization. I mean, I think Cornel West would be surprised that he's doing David Horowitz's bidding, in Heterodox. So yeah, it's just a bizarre. That said, though, and maybe you and I might disagree with this a little bit. I don't know. I'd be curious to know. Like, having more conservative voices actually does enhance truth. And what I mean by that is my own research, and I can get into it if you're curious, we've talked about it in prior podcasts, shows that our underlying moral and political sensibilities, which link to our political identity, actually does shape the kind of knowledge that we're attracted to exploring, right? And when you have a situation, and Sarah Guinean, however you pronounce her name, she manages, I would say, cherry picks one source, claiming that there really isn't a liberal predominance in higher ed. I mean, there's overwhelming evidence. My field in sociology and cultural in anthropology. I mean, it's overwhelming. I did a massive survey of economists and found that there were only like 4% conservative. I kid you not. And there were 3 times as many liberals almost as libertarians, even in economics. So it's simply not true that what they claim. They found a source that claimed there's not so much liberal predominance. There is overwhelming liberal. And what that does is again, there's no boogeyman. I'm not suggesting liberal professors have this conscious agenda to deny the truth of students, but people gravitate to claims that resonate with them. And it actually is healthier, I would argue, to have even ideological. Again, I'm not advocating affirmative action for conservatives per se, but I think awareness among liberal faculty. How many of us have been on search committees with conservative candidates where they may not be as welcome over the years? So I think some effort to check that, I think, is very important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I guess when I get to like the way she's narrowly defining in some of these. So in number 2, she says viewpoint diversity can, should work or could work only as an instrumental value, which sort of gets to what you're talking about. Like when it is advancing the pursuit of truth, diversity should be, viewpoint diversity should be pursued. But then once the truth, which, you and I in social, we're like, well, the truth, a truth, we're much more. But if we were talking about, something, sort of a mathematical proof or something like that, that we don't need, and so I think that, again, she's being very, like you said, very cherry picking. She's being very, very careful about what she picks. And I think that her argument here, where she says, if hiring a faculty member holding QAnon beliefs helps the rest of us find some common ground with QAnon members on the January 6th convictions, that would be an unbelievable political triumph. And so she's picking something, and I think she's right. Like in that case, if we hire someone who has, just because they have, it's like, oh, we don't have enough, make America MAGA people on. If that's why we hire somebody, it is not going to work. She is correct about that. That we are just, and that gets at your point. Like, it's like that those schemas are never going to overlap, right? We're never going to get to a place where those faculty sort of say, oh yeah, we, you're right about these things, and we should include those in my. I don't think that's going to happen. So I don't think forcing, and that's a very extreme example.
Well, and that's where I would jump in, Elizabeth. It's let's say you accept, and maybe the listener doesn't, but I do, that we have overwhelming ideological monoculture in higher ed, and that's a problem. Students are getting, as the Shields article shows, whether students are getting one side all too often of salient social and political issues. It's important to have the other side. So what does this author do? She says, oh, by the other side, then you must mean the Holocaust denier, yes. The QAnon, goes to these extremist views, yeah. Which, and again, that to me strikes me as enough straw yeah. to fill a barn, frankly. Yeah. The issue from my standpoint, what animated many of my academic surveys, was that higher ed, because of its monoculture, is actually losing sight of even what could be argued to be the most mainstream views in some scenarios. I know this is a sensitive one. I'll just bring it up to give you an example, because I was thinking about this prior to the survey today, prior to the discussion today. I carried out a survey with a couple colleagues of mine, Anthony Hayner and Kenneth Kickham, on views that are salient in sociology. We did a podcast on this. And one of them has to do with, if you look at the gendered landscapes of professions, you're not going to find, 50% male and female nurses or 50% male and female engineers, for example. And this has been a politicized issue, the whole question of STEM and underrepresentation of females in STEM and so on. So what we did is we surveyed our field on that one question. By the way, I have dozens of other examples of other topics on immigration and tons of things if you want to talk about it. And we had a question, for example, that said, political efforts to increase representation by gender in STEM, though desirable, may fall short of parity in part due to average differences biologically between men and women. Because there's wide evidence that shows women tend to gravitate to work with people more than men do, men with things. There's also controversial cognitive studies of the differences here. And 7% of liberals in my field find that plausible. So yeah. I didn't even ask them if they find it true. Right. Is it plausible that even though it's a good idea to try to fight for equality in STEM, we may not reach perfect parity in part due to an average difference? And that was 7%. That to me strikes me as wildly, it's not even consistent with the science, never mind with public opinion. So if you have that kind of monoculture driving those sorts of assumptions, how likely, and I think the authors, did they mention the Judith Butler book on gender trouble?
Yes, they did, yes.
How likely is an academic in my field or an anthropology or related field to teach with Judith Butler a book that deals with the biopsychology of sex and gender? Yeah, they're simply not going to do it. And then they're coming home, and then their brothers or sisters or parents over Thanksgiving dinner, like, what do you believe? And they're going to think academics are crazy. And so then we have this woman coming in and saying, well, if you advocate any attempt to integrate countervailing voices, you have to bring in the Holocaust deniers and things like that. And it's just a straw man argument to the core. And I obviously rather staunchly disagree with it. But anyway.
Yeah. And then let's see. So her third, so we pretty much don't agree, like her first and second, we're like not going there. And again, like she's making, if she's making a cogent argument, but she's using, I can't, she's not getting me there, even though like I understand. And, you know, it's like there's sentences that I agree with, like the one that I just read about she's right. And yet I'm still not there. Viewpoint diversity assumes a partisan goal based on unproven assumptions. So, you know, she's basically saying here that, you know, it would not, you know, this she's very focused on political diversity. It would not resolve or even address any academic issue, dilemma, or debate. And you know, I mean, I think she might be right. She might not be right.
Well, my research suggests that she's wrong. Let me just briefly explain why. In question after question that my colleagues over the last 10 years, we've done large academic surveys of various fields on controversial issues. And what we find is that the further you get away, like if you start with radical and then you go to liberal and then you go to moderate, then you go to conservative and then libertarian, what you do find, and this cuts both ways. When we did a survey of economists, we find that the conservative view, in our view, was out of step, right? You know, with the public. So I hope the listener doesn't think this is some critique solely of liberal academia. That's not the case. But right now we're in a situation because of liberal predominance. We have the statistics, like I just said, 7% of sociologists believe what I said earlier, that it's plausible that although desirable to try to get equality, same number of women and men engineers, it may not reach parity due in part to biology. That's such a tiny number, but it moderates. I hope I don't get the number wrong. I think it was just under 30%. Moderate sociologists believe that's plausible, that there could be an average difference biopsychologically between men and women. It's better. So let's go back to Serengetian point. It's like, oh, there's no evidence that viewpoint diversity is going to lead to better approximation of the truth. Well, that's my studies demonstrate again and again that it's indeed the case that when you have diverse political sensibilities among faculty, they're going to be raising different kinds of questions. If there were any conservative sociologists, because there pretty much aren't any, I'm pretty sure they would have had a higher degree of plausibility on that question, right? And I'm not even saying this to you know, throwing an axe and saying that side's correct. I just want the full spectrum of views, just like Shields et al. I want the full spectrum of views to be presented to students, especially in the context of such wider social polarization, as well as eroding legitimacy. And that's where I agree with, was it Serengetian or the other author who said we're concerned about the confidence in higher ed today?
I think both of them both of them.
Okay, yeah.
Both of them get to the.
Yeah. We're not going to get confidence unless we have students hearing ideas that are both scientifically and welcome public.
I would be interested to know that if you had put a question on there that said, you know, the goal would be to have, you know, equal representation of, I don't know, bricklayers or underwater welders. If people would have said that they thought that it was plausible that because of gender differences, you might not reach, you know, parity. You know, because my suspicion is that they would have said, "Oh, that's totally plausible," right? Because women, you know, I mean, they just would have said, "Oh, well, not strong enough, not, you know, that there's certain physical qualities that would differ in mass, you know, not in any particular case, but en masse, that would potentially prevent women from, you know, being roofers at the same level as men." You know,
we didn't ask that. I know we have another question.
As a comparison, do you know
right.
what I mean? Yeah.
There's a far more, what I would say, kind of reasonable question we asked about women are more attracted to people-oriented fields like nursing and social work, we might have said, and then it gets higher, maybe a quarter.
People
of the
are more likely
respondents,
to.
it's plausible. Yeah, but you know, I think many people believe that there's a wide range of social science literature that does indeed show that this may indeed be biopsychological. And there's lots of literature about empathy and compassion. There's literature in moral foundations showing that females tend to be more on the liberal end of their moral foundations. So yeah, there's lots of evidence pointing in the same direction here that got plausibility to that. It needs to be part of the conversation, and regrettably, it's largely not in our social science classes.
Right. So her thesis 4 is viewpoint diversity undermines disciplinary and specialized knowledge and standards, as well as the autonomy of academic reasoning and scholarship. So, she says, put most bluntly, viewpoint diversity is an anathema to academic freedom. When we talk about freedom of the academic to dictate the terms of his or her work, we also unavoidably are talking about the freedom to exclude or limit the exposure of work that is not deemed to meet academic standards. So again, very different from the other article where they are trying, in fact, maybe in some cases, there are, one of the reasons, maybe we talked about this, maybe one of the reasons they're not finding the other articles or books being assigned is because maybe they are essentially almost too difficult, where the one that is being assigned in that previous article, the closed classrooms article, maybe the articles or the books that are being chosen are because they're more popular press books. In this case, we have, the argument that she's saying that this viewpoint diversity would force us to be reading or assigning or whatever crappy stuff. Poor. So
yeah, because that's how she's decided to define viewpoint diversity.
Yes,
not as a desire to integrate other reasonable scientists who take positions contrary to the heterodox one, or the dominant one in social science or in the sciences broadly, but again, the phlogiston believers or the Holocaust denialists, and that's not where we stand. And one thing I've noticed in talking to fellow social scientists, they always say, "Oh no, we just focus on the truth." Everybody believes that they're doing everything solely within the realm of the truth. She is right, I would say, that this encouraging viewpoint diversity in higher education, if it were imposed, and obviously I don't support what Trump is doing and the threatening universities and leveraging them, that's all fundamentally wrong. So if that's what she's talking about, I'm on board with it. But the idea that heterodox encourages us to be aware that our moral and political sensibilities can often lead to a kind of groupthink, even when we don't want it to. And so to go out of our way to engage literature that unsettles our assumptions is a healthy move. Her move in the paper, though, seems to be viewpoint diversity means the most extreme positions have to be welcomed. We have to have the QAnon people teaching our students, that kind of thing. And I just fundamentally reject that perspective. But if imposed, it would be an infringement on academic freedom. I agree with her there.
Yeah. She says her fifth one is that viewpoint diversity is incoherent. This is only one paragraph. So she says you cannot simultaneously defend rigorous arguments in support of the university striving for truth and support rigorous arguments for ideological diversity. And I mean, again, I guess I would, the way that she's defining things, okay, but no, not really.
Well, in the hard sciences, I think she makes a lot of sense. You said earlier, mathematical proofs. There's no evidence that a Trump versus a Kamala Harris math teacher is going to teach the math differently. But the problem when it comes to humanities and social sciences, there's overwhelming evidence that a Trump versus a Harris follower will select texts. So regrettably, we have to be aware that there is a fundamental difference when you're dealing with different content and even different aspects of the mission of higher education in terms of forming the full citizen. I don't see how we form a full citizen if we systematically deny them one side of the political equation. So it's not advocating ideology for ideology's sake. When I say to you, I want viewpoint diversity and it would be healthy for higher ed to have more conservatives, frankly, it's not from the point of let's have more conservatives as my goal. It's recognizing, based on my own research and other research that I've read, that the political sensibilities of scholars does indeed influence their choice of texts, which means downstream, it has a big impact on the truth as well as on collective trust. Because when people are saying things in a one-sided way, it gets weaponized in social media and everything else. It contributes to the erosion of collective trust that we're seeing throughout our society.
So one of the things that I thought of when I read this was, let's just go through and do a search and replace. Take out politics and insert race. what would this article look that, well, first of all, it never would have gotten published.
Oh, like,
right?
so she's saying like I'm against racial diversity.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes. And so racial diversity would not solve any problems. It would not add to discussions or solve. I mean, look, could that have gotten published?
No, it's a great point. Yeah.
Oh, and so when I think that when your argument is that
Categorical.
yes, then it maybe you need to revise the paper a little bit. If you're that dependent upon something like politics in order to make your argument make sense, then maybe your argument doesn't make as much sense. Because again, as she describes it, these extremes, it's like, oh, we got to, like you said, we got to get these extreme, debunked things into, we have to hire a flat earther, and we have to, all that kind of, it's like, now come on, right? But again, if you had put in other kinds of, if we'd put in race, this would not have been published, and this would be considered, defamatory, and, it's like, outrageous, right?
Yeah, I think she has a kind of broadside against heterodox people in there too, where she says, although they advocate viewpoint diversity, they're time and again opposed to DEI.
Yes.
She puts a line in there, which again, it demonstrates her own sort of political sensibilities as a progressive scholar. A dollar to a donut. She's a progressive scholar.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't know if she's a lawyer actually, but she's professor of.
I thought it was languages or something like.
Yeah, you're right. She does have. Well, okay. Here's what led me to that. She's writing a book. Her next book, "The Problem of Personhood: Giving Rights to Trees, Corporations, and Robots."
Yeah,
and that's what made me think, because that is a legalistic kind of thing. So it made me. So, and then number 7 is, then this is what you just mentioned, viewpoint diversity is an argument made in bad faith. And again, if you put in racial diversity is an argument made in bad faith, it kind of give you that cringe, right? Ew, that little effect.
Yeah, in my senior seminar class, I'm not thrilled with the term. I'm trying to come up with a better one, but I use the phrase ideology critique. Is when you attack a text by basically it's like similar to ad hominem in a way. You're basically saying the author has an agenda, and that's why we should dismiss this work.
Mm-hmm.
The author has some ideological agenda, and they're trying to, surreptitiously perhaps convey certain ideas to support one group over another group, typically a dominant group in society over a subordinate group, and that's a reason to dismiss and not engage their ideas. So yeah, attacking the motive has never been a convincing. And, it's news to me that I advocate viewpoint diversity in bad faith as a member of Heterodox Academy. I'll have to do some introspection to see if there's some validity to that claim.
I mean, look, we're all guilty of hypocrisies, all of us.
Sure.
But, and I love examining my own hypocrisies. And oftentimes I do, most of the time I don't resolve them. I'm just like, well, I guess I'm a hypocrite.
Well, we're ambivalent. We live in a state of ambivalence.
Yeah, it's like, well, it depends, and look, that's why we have courts of law, right? Because it does depend. The truth of the matter is sometimes it depends. There are mitigating circumstances, and those are admissible in court. Interesting, what you were just talking about with this ideological perspective, and sort of making the attack that person is not to be believed. I was just talking about that in my class on Thursday. We called that a schemer's schema.
It's really interesting. I like the alliteration.
Yeah. So this idea that we have, because we're talking about, my first topic is mis and disinformation. So I just chose the first topic, and I'm like, this is what we're doing. And so we're talking right now about social cognition, attitudes, and persuasion, and then they'll do something with that on so kind of like around mis and disinformation. So of course, social cognition, we were talking about schemas, and our schemas about the world, and how that can lead us to accept or reject certain information, mostly accept information that maybe we shouldn't, but also reject ideas that don't fit our schema, right? And so, but we were talking about how we have a schemer's schema. So
it's tempting. I've been working on a book on these matters, and I'm yet to find a perfect way of approaching.
Well, there you go.
It might be a bit like too psychological for where I want to go, but it's still very good with the word schema,
Yeah.
which I like, don't get me wrong. But yeah, going back to the article though, like her using David Horowitz and linking it to heterodox, it's a very tribal thing. It's like anybody, AAUP, by the way, proud member of AAUP my whole, many, many years, an academic. But AAUP members are overwhelmingly liberal left. They're going to hear David Horowitz. It triggers talk about a schema.
Right.
Triggers all of their negative associations.
Yeah, he's a schemer.
Right.
He's a schemer, and I have a schema about that, right? Which is that he's going to try to trick me, or like you said, oh, it's spin. It's all spin. Everything's spin. And I get it that we are faced with a lot of spin.
We are.
We get a lot of it.
Again, it only speaks to the tribalism and distrust moment we're in right now. That any effort, and I know it from my own life, somebody who been involved in progressive movements my whole life and went through it, although I'm not on the right, I went through a transformation in my worldview, and I began to raise questions that I wouldn't even be able to think of in the past, and encountering the kind of opposition from my progressive colleagues on these things and the discomfort in raising hypotheses that run counter their views. It's very, very common for people to instinctually, instead of someone hearing an argument, they go, oh, you're one of those. Place in that group over there, and then you can just safely dismiss it. So yeah,
and that's really what she's doing here. She's by using these examples that are so extreme.
Yes,
you read it and you're like, oh yeah, well of course we shouldn't hire. Of course not. And again, if you flip this around, and I mean, it's not. This isn't a perfect argument. It annoys me, I guess, all the time when people say, well, Trump said blah, 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 blah. Of course, if Obama said that, and I mean, it's a different world now. I mean, the times are different. Everything's different. So we don't know, like if an Obama type were president the world has changed completely. I'm teaching this social psych class for the first time in like 6 or 7 years. I mean, that might as well be 60 years in terms of like where we are right now, so the same kind of thing. But
I feel for what it's worth tribeless. Like I don't entertain those sorts of claims just because I'm not interested anymore in getting into a tribe, feeling good about myself against some other group. I've lost an appetite for it, and I'm deeply interested in sort of just mapping this kind of ideological landscape and exploring how people's morals and emotions and political orientations influence how they see the world. And I'm just worried about our state of collective distrust. We have to get beyond it. And for this author to associate everything, this is my take. I could be being unfair to her, but my take is if a heterodox person approaches you, they're a wolf in sheep's clothing. They're actually doing David Horowitz's bidding. And I just don't, the vast majority of the people I know in the organization are not advocating that. We just think we're in a one-sided scenario and that needs some balance, especially in the context of wider social polarization.
Yeah. Well, I thank you so much for this.
Thank you. No, it's been a wonderful conversation.
And I appreciate it. Hopefully we'll have you back soon.
Yes, I look forward to that, Elizabeth.
Thank you for listening. Please consider donating to the Institute for Liberal Values, a 501c3 nonprofit organization at ilvalues.org. All donations go to support our continued programming to realize our mission to provide the skills and support required to build community where there has been division, to encourage free expression where there has been censorship, and to foster optimism where there is fear.